Hello and welcome to Changing World. My name is Anthony Smith, and today I'm with a guest who has appeared on one of these podcasts before. It's Dr. Terry Moore. Dr. Terry Moore set up the Cat Survival Trust, which he now runs full-time up in Hertfordshire in England. It was set up to provide a refuge for certain endangered species. Now, Terry is also a conservationist, and he spent a lot of time out in Central and South America in an effort to protect the rainforests. So, welcome back, Terry. It's good to have you here again.
Hello, Anthony.
How are you?
It's still cold. I think, but last time we spoke, it was cold here. It's still quite cold up here today.
Yep.
I think we're facing a bit of snow in the next week. So,
oh really?
I'm not looking forward to that.
No, we just have to cope as best we can. Right, Terry. Well, today we thought we'd talk about climate change, what's happening in the world, all over the world right now, because I know that climate change is something that you've done a lot of research into, and I know that you've got a lot of information which you'd like to get out into the public domain. So, how did you first get interested in climate change and what's going on around the world globally?
Well, over the years, it's been patently obvious that climate change is affecting us, but of course, from our perspective, we've been looking at how it's affecting animals. And over the years, there's been an escalation in problems that animals and ourselves are facing because of the escalation. We originally were just looking at the effects on cats, obviously, but in fact, climate change affects all of us. So by studying the effects on cats and other animals, we've highlighted all the things that are affecting humans as well.
Right, well that's an important point. Obviously, we live in an ecosystem, and within that ecosystem there's a lot of interdependency. For example, the food chain, we rely on food from animals as a major source of food, as well as plant food. And that's probably not going to change, is it?
No, that won't change, but certainly the climate change is having a dramatic effect on food production.
Right. So in terms of how we're going to be affected by this, is this a long-term trend which you can see is going to have quite a bad effect in coming decades on our ability to produce the amount of food which is going to be needed, especially given that the population is continually growing? We're now at more than 7.5 billion on the planet, and it's predicted to be 8 billion probably before 2020.
Well, this is where it gets very complex, because there are many causes of the climate change which affects all of us. Obviously, population is something that is not necessarily PC for us to talk about, but let's face it, the problem here is as we have more and more people, it becomes more and more difficult to produce enough food. And already we're facing a situation in many countries where they just aren't getting enough food to survive. So as population increases, it's going to get worse. So where's the problem? Well, I look at it this way. At school, most of us are taught about sex, but they only talk about the mechanics. They don't explain that, this little experiment that you might want to try, could ultimately ruin your life. You could end up with a child quite unexpectedly. This is going to cost a lot of time, effort and energy and money to look after, and it means that you won't be able to do all the things that individuals can do who have no children.
Right.
So just on that pure point alone, we need to explain that sex is something that should only happen between two people who love, honour, respect, trust each other, and should take enough precautions to make sure that we don't get unwanted births. Let's face it, sadly it is reckoned that 76% of all births are unplanned. So here we have a problem, because in some countries they've tried to deal with this, and what happens then is you end up with a higher proportion of old people who then have to be provided with food and housing, whatever, and if you have a falling population at the other end, there aren't enough people to pay the taxes to provide all the facilities you need for the old. This is a major problem that we have to deal with. But it's not just population. As we increase the population, we're destroying more habitat. This is affecting climate phenomenally. Now, historically, this planet relied on a band of trees around the tropics. And those trees were performing a wonderful task. As moisture was absorbed from the ocean, it would travel across those forests, those tropical forests. In the morning, the heat of the sun would produce mist coming up from the trees, which would seed those clouds, and then that tropical rain would fall onto the trees and stop it from moving north and south of the tropics to drench all the other countries. But we keep cutting the trees down. And as we cut more trees down, we haven't got global warming, but we've got warming around the tropics. So as there are less trees, the temperature increases, and more moisture is absorbed from the oceans around the tropics, producing more cloud, and much denser cloud than we've had historically. As a result of that extra cloud, without as many trees, escapes the tropics, causing increased flooding worldwide every year, and it's on the increase. So here is another major problem contributing to climate change. Unfortunately, of course, habitat destruction affects animals, but we apparently need to clear the land to grow more food. But it's not just food. We grow crops to produce biofuels. And yet we're told that there's plenty of oil in the ground. So why are we using food, which could be feeding the hungry, to produce biofuels? It's total insanity.
Yeah, I can well see your point there. It does seem a little bit crazy, doesn't it? It's that obviously the problem, as we both know, is it comes down to the big corporations who are in control of some of this. They buy up the land. Obviously, within certain parameters they can do what they want, and they're just simply profit driven. So if they see a profit in manufacturing biofuels, then that's what they'll manufacture.
And this is really what this is about. It's talking about short-term profit for current people, forgetting the fact that we have children, we have grandchildren that will be coming onto this planet now and in the future, and we're destroying the planet for them. So these corporations, they're increasing chemical pollution, they're releasing radioactive material, so there's radioactive pollution.
Yep.
We've got mining, we've got gas and oil extraction, we've got waste dumped into rivers, we've got plastic islands in the middle of oceans, and all of this is helping to affect climate.
Well, yes, obviously, Terry, there are various knock-on effects. Another effect, of course, is the problem with plastic in the oceans, which has caused, well, it's caused a lot of problem for ocean life, especially fish and larger animals which are in the ocean, like turtles, for example. Even sharks have had problems with plastic waste, haven't they? And getting entangled in plastic waste, which just gets thrown away and ultimately ends up in the ocean.
And of course, this plastic is breaking up into minute particles which get into the fish that we eat. So, what comes around goes around, or what goes around comes around, however you want to look at it. We are absolutely destroying this planet. And all this plastic is now affecting populations of marine life. And let's face it, a third of the population of this planet rely on fish as part of their source of protein. So it's affecting the climate, but it's also affecting us by doing the things that we do.
Exactly. And we really need a solution. Now, the problem we have, of course, is that it just happens to be that the way that our society has developed is that plastic bags have become just taken for granted, that whenever you have to carry something, you pop it into a plastic bag, don't you? Now, I can remember when I was very young, when I used to go down to the market or the supermarket, they actually used to sell produce and put it in a paper bag. Now, I think what probably happened was that at some stage somebody thought to them, or maybe the companies got together and said, why do we need to buy paper bags? We can use plastic bags. This is the latest technology. At that time, that was the latest, newest thing. So everybody moved over to plastic bags. But at that time, we simply didn't appreciate what the knock-on effect of that was going to be 20 or 30 years into the future, did we?
We certainly didn't. I remember when I was young, drinks used to be in glass bottles, and as a youngster I would go along to parking spots along roadways and collect all the glass bottles because you were getting a deposit back on the bottles.
That's right.
And although it was a bit of a bind doing it, it was a very useful way of increasing your income from your pocket money and other sources.
Exactly. Well, it's a shame that we don't seem to have many of those schemes. I mean, at least not in that sense that you get a physical reward for it. I mean, obviously, the councils up and down the country have encouraged us to put anything to be recycled into a separate bin. But as you well know, Terry, that really doesn't go all the way to solving the problem, does it?
It certainly doesn't. But bear in mind that plastic, if it's used properly, can actually help us a lot. There was a very good documentary quite recently on television about all the fruit and vegetables that are produced in Europe, particularly along the Mediterranean. And the only reason we're getting all this fresh fruit and vegetables is that they have hundreds of acres covered by polythene to make sure we get all the food we need in the supermarkets. And in fact, because of the intense cold in parts of Europe at this very moment, there are people who are really rushing to cover some of this food that didn't technically need covering because of the snow that's falling in Europe.
Right.
So, it's a really difficult question. What do you do if you can't use plastic? It would be too costly to put everything under grass. It would push up the cost of food.
Yeah.
But in that documentary, when they finished with the plastic, when it starts deteriorating, they just heap it up next to rivers. It breaks down, and all these particles of plastic then empty their way down into the Mediterranean, affecting all the marine life in the Mediterranean. So we have to act much more responsibly.
Well, I mean, obviously, we need a solution, which is going to be possibly the next major step forward in terms of caring for the environment, because it doesn't look like we're all just going to stop using plastic, does it?
Oh, that won't in itself help. I mean, what we can do, we should replant all the areas where we're cutting down trees, particularly around the tropics.
Right.
And actually in other places, as I'll explain why in a minute, we need to be much more responsible about what we're growing crops for. There is a big movement at the moment to get more people to become vegetarian or at least cut back on the amount of meat they eat, because sadly the production of meat needs vast quantities of grain. It also consumes vast amounts of water. So this is something which again we're short of, and if you start extracting all the water from underground deposits, they don't refill, because in some areas climate is changing so dramatically they're not getting the water they used to have. In Australia, they've had to kill 60% of their livestock because climate change has stopped rain falling, providing the water that's needed for the forage crops for the livestock to eat.
I see.
But so there are certain things that we can look at and be much more responsible about. We can be careful about the pollution that's generated by the chemical factories, by the mining, by the oil extraction. These are things which all contribute, not a particularly high level, but they all contribute towards changes in climate. But, of course, the one thing that we can't do anything about is pole shift.
Right, Terry. Now, that's an important point you just raised. I think the average man on the street is possibly not that aware of this particular phenomenon. But I gather you've done some research into this yourself. Would you like to just explain in layman's terms what is happening with the pole, the two poles, and what is the theory behind why this is happening?
Well, you may recall back in the early 90s, I gave a series of talks to the London School of Economics, and one of the talks was about this very subject. Now, every 300 to 600,000 years on this planet, there is a pole shift. The theory, I mean, there are lots of theories about why this happens, but the one I favour is the fact that we have in the centre of our planet the core, which is a massive, very powerful magnet. Over many thousands of hundreds of thousands of years, that North Pole impregnates north into all the magnetic material, the iron ore and whatever, in the crust. And the crust floats on magma. So we've got the core, the magma, and then the crust. And after a long period of time, there's an interaction between the generated North Pole on the crust and the very powerful North Pole of the core. And as we know from all our studies at school, two norths don't get on. And so it gets to a tipping point where the two norths start to react. And 16 years ago, according to the United States Geological Survey, according to NOAA, two very respected scientific bodies, that we started the next pole shift. Now, the magnetic north danced around not very big distances for many years, but 16 years ago it decided to go in a straight line towards Siberia. It's moved over 1,600 miles so far. And that's a huge distance in such a short time. Now, as a result of that, for instance, you may have been driving your car with the sat-nav on and suddenly seen that you're not on the road, you're in a field next door. Well, that's because the satellites haven't been readjusted quickly enough to make the adjustment. And if you start researching this, you find that the airports are forever changing their coordinates because the magnetic north is changing, and if the aircraft didn't know the new position of magnetic north, they would land in a field next to the airstrip if it was in fog. So there are lots of serious issues going on, but the main problem is that this pole shift is now having a dramatic effect on the weather. It's altering the position of the jet stream, it's changing ocean currents, and it's dramatically affecting the melting of ice in the Arctic and the Antarctic. Because physically what's happening is the crust is slipping. The core stays the same. In Florida, at high tide, because Florida, particularly Miami, is moving towards that bulge of ocean around the tropics, at high tide, salt water is now coming up the streets up the drains into the streets. Already the Florida Keys, all the trees have died because the salt water is coming up and killing all the trees. And if you look at historically, and this is what we look at in all our research, we look at what is happening. We don't look at computer models because you can't put all the factors in to come up with the answer. But just look at world fires in California, in Mexico, in Texas, and in Australia. What have we had increasingly over the past few years? We've had more and more forest fires because North America is slipping towards the equator, southwards, and Australia is moving northwards towards the equator to a much hotter band. The other problem is that band of forest in the Amazon, Central Africa, and in Indonesia and Philippines are moving away from the equator. So it's bad enough that we've cut the trees down, but now those trees that used to protect us from extreme temperatures and rainfall and everything else are moving away from their historic positions around the tropics. This is all adding to the misery that we're seeing worldwide on an increasing case every year. I mean, typically at this very moment, we're talking we're actually talking today on the 20th of January. At this precise moment in time, Central Europe, particularly places like Greece, Poland, the east side of Russia, of Germany, have got up to 10 foot of snow. The north part of North America have already got, in places, 4 foot of snow, and it's still falling. A lot of these places are locked in. They can't get to the local shops. Now, that's bad enough, but think about the poor animals. In the past couple of years, in the winter in Siberia, wild animals are freezing to death. Farm animals that they can't keep warm are freezing to death. And this is increasing year by year because as Siberia moves up towards the Arctic, they're going to get colder. Last year, they recorded minus 83 in parts of Siberia because they're moving up towards the Arctic. So you can imagine, with that huge landmass of Siberia moving up towards the Arctic, that is now going to accumulate huge quantities of snow with all this extra cloud that's being generated around the tropics. That's how glaciers will form. And as you've got such a huge landmass, that cold is now being dragged across the top of the planet, down into Canada, down into North America, and down into Europe, because the wind direction, the ocean currents are all changing. In this country, in the UK, we are slightly better off. At the moment, we are protected by the warmth of the Gulf Stream. So by the time these clouds have come up across the Atlantic towards the Caribbean, then up the east coast, a fair proportion of that moisture has dropped. So by the time those storms arrive at us in England, a lot of that moisture has already dropped, and so we're protected by the Gulf Stream, which is warming the sea and keeping our coastline relatively warm compared to a lot of places. So this pole shift, which is something we can't do anything about, is something which, sadly, again, the media aren't reporting. But to be fair, there were two very good articles in the Daily Mail. Now, I'm not really a supporter of the Daily Mail, but last year they did have two very good introductory articles, which you can see on the internet. But what I would really recommend is that our listeners put the word pole shift as a search in their internet facility, because up will come hundreds of articles, videos, lectures in universities, which all confirm this is happening. So this is something that's having a massive effect, more effect than anything we're doing. It's something which I really recommend our listeners research and look into.
Right. Well, I'm sure you've given our listeners a very good starting point there, Terry, for them to go off and do their own research in their own time. I mean, what would you say we can do in order to if we feel we want to do something positive? Is there anything that we can do?
Right, there are quite a few bits and pieces. For instance, there's a very good magazine called Ethical Consumer.
Yeah.
They look into all the major businesses that produce our various products and food, and they look at the most ethical companies. The companies that don't research on animals, that don't use really nasty chemicals, that source all their raw materials from sustainable sources. And if we all take that step and look at the most ethical, the most environmentally friendly company that produce products that we're using, then it might force some of the others to change the way they do things.
Right.
Let's face it, we have a tremendous amount of power as a consumer. So perhaps not buying a car that produces more nasty fumes, particularly some, I won't mention the names, but they manage to have a device in them that hides their pollution when they're going for an MOT. Really sneaky thing to do. But obviously change to electric if you can. And nowadays electric cars are seeing much more on the roads. I have a Leaf myself, and a 4 kilowatt solar array, so technically you could say I was generating my own energy. So, I mean, this is very much the sort of thing people can do. You've got to look at the ethical companies and support them. You've got to look at perhaps not using the plastic bags. Take a cloth bag, buy it once and keep using it. It's no good the government saying, oh, well, we're going to increase the charge of plastic bags. Unfortunately, we're lazy. We really need to go back to the old days where we took a basket to do our shopping. This is something that's reusable, which is often made of ethically friendly raw materials. And so there are things that we can do. Bear in mind that as we increase the problems with climate change, it's not a bad idea to have a few extra tins of food stored in your cupboard. So that if you are hit, your particular area is hit by a really bad snowstorm, at least you've got some food in the house. It's not just that you might not be able to get to the food store, but the food store might not get a delivery. And this is happening in a massive way in parts of Europe at this very moment. It's happening in a massive way in North America and Canada. So there are lots of things that you can do to just make sure that you're ready if there is a catastrophe in your area.
Yes, that is certainly an important consideration for lots of communities around the globe. As you say, we're a bit more fortunate in this country that we don't usually get hit with a massive catastrophe, but there are certainly areas which have experienced major flooding in recent years, which has been a huge inconvenience to certain people. But as you say, we are fortunate that we have the Gulf Stream, which does seem to help the climate. So anyway, Terry, what would you like to add to what we've talked about now?
Well, the main thing is to really research this question of climate change. We have had so many people who have got friends and relatives in areas, places like India, southern China, Vietnam, Philippines have been really badly hit. If you're aware of what's going on, you do need to contact people that you know in these areas to see if you can help. We are talking over the past few years of millions of people who've lost their homes, in fact lost everything they own. And we're getting to a stage now where there is so much extreme climate change, there isn't enough insurance money stashed away to help these poor people. Governments are finding it a struggle anyway. So, I mean, you look at America, New Orleans, that was destroyed all those years ago by that massive storm.
Yeah.
Very few of those homes have been rebuilt. And then Houston was hit last year. We've had all those fires in California, in Texas, in Mexico, in Australia. This is affecting so many people, and it is sadly going to get worse. So, if for instance your home, you've got some woodland nearby, it's worth cutting down, sadly, a little bit of the vegetation next to your house, and be aware that if it's very hot at a particular time of the year, it's not a bad idea just to spray the ground with some water, so that if sadly that particular area were to catch fire, at least you're going to save your home. We need to consider fire breaks. We need to make sure that these fires, if they do start, don't cover a huge area and put so many animals at risk, so many people at risk. These are very simple things to do, things that we should be thinking about now. It's too late if you leave it until the event happens.
That's right. Preparation of course, is the important word. Always try and do a bit of preparation. So, anyway, Terry, I would like to thank you for joining me in this podcast, and I hope the viewers have found it interesting, and I hope they got something out of it. And we'll look forward to hearing from you again, Terry. Okay, thank you very much.
Yes, if anyone wants any more information, they can email us at cattrust@aol.com. And sorry about the phone, I'll just cancel that. So they can find out more. We have a number of documents I can send by email with lots of links to all the source material that we use for the talks we have here. So please don't hesitate to contact us if you want some more basic information.
Thank you very much, Terry, and thank you to everybody who has been listening, and we'll see you next time. Goodbye.
Okay. Thank you very much.